We're continuing Wilfred Grenfell, Chapter 8, A Growing Mission. Wilfred was delighted with the progress he saw. The old house that served as the new hospital was a sturdy two-story structure tucked close into a rocky cliff. It looked strong enough to endure even the most severe winter. Inside the building, Dr. Kerwin and the two nurses were working hard to set up the 16 beds and equipment that Albert had brought with her. Wilfred's friend Arthur liked what he saw too, and was eager to open the hospital doors to the fishermen and coastal people. Within a week, everything was ready, and Wilfred conducted a ceremony to open the Battle Harbor Hospital. With the new hospital open, Wilfred continued on up the Labrador coast in the Princess May with just one crew member, an engineer from St. John's named Paul Leggett. Arthur stayed behind to help man the new hospital. Wilfred's plan was to weave his way up through the rocky bays and inlets, going as far north as 100 miles beyond Hopedale. He had heard of only one other steamer that had made it that far north. Along the way, he would take notes on the condition of the people he met and any possible way they could be helped to lead better lives. One of Wilfred's first stops was Sandwich Bay, where in the 1790s an Englishman, Mayor Cartwright, had established a small settlement. Mayor Cartwright had brought 400 people from Devon and Cornwall in England to the community to live and catch fish and trap seals. Their catches were sent back to England for sale to provide income for the community. All went well until the first years of the 19th century, when Britain and the United States had gone to war against each other. American privateers had captured the ships laden with goods from Sandwich Bay, and the year's earnings for the community were lost. At that time, all but the most stubborn settlers returned to England, and now Wilfred visited the descendants of those who had remained to eke out a living for themselves. The people lived in a few scattered huts, having little contact with the outside world. Wilfred brought them news and medical help. From Sandwich Bay, Wilfred steamed on to Indian Harbor, where he found the Albert lying at anchor. Dr. Kerwin and Nurse Williams were hard at work treating the injuries and ailments of the fishermen whose boats were anchored around the Albert. Because of the number of fishermen who had to be treated, the work of preparing the new Indian Harbor Hospital had fallen behind schedule, and Wilfred could see that the hospital would not be completed before the ice packs formed. Everyone decided it would be best to delay the official opening of the second hospital until the following year. It was decided that instead the Albert would continue sailing up and down the Labrador coast, working among the fishing fleet. Wilfred and Paul continued their trip north. Their next stop was Rigolet, and they steamed on to Hopedale, where they planned to rendezvous with the Albert once again. The voyage to Hopedale was eventful. At one point, the Princess May found herself in a maze of reefs. Strong winds buffeted the vessel, and night began to fall. Wilfred prayed for wisdom as he shinned up the mast in search of a way through the maze. With some deft maneuvering, he managed to reach the leeward side of an island, but Wilfred knew that the Princess May would not be safe there overnight. As he and Paul wondered what to do, they were relieved to see 3 skin-covered Eskimo boats bobbing their way toward the Princess May. Wilfred grinned as the Eskimo who manned the boats and threw his bowline to them. The Eskimos skillfully guided the Princess May into a narrow channel between the rocks where she would be safe until the buffeting wind subsided. Wilfred transferred to one of the skin boats, which took him ashore. The Eskimos, recognizing him from his previous visit along the coast the year before, brought their sick to see him in his tent. Gangrene had set into one man's toe as a result of frostbite, and Wilfred amputated the toe on the spot. Other people had lung problems or cuts and bruises. When he had treated them all, Wilfred held a service in the tent. He knew very few words in the Inuit language, but Wilfred knew he was among the Christian converts of the Moravians, and he was glad for the unspoken fellowship. The following morning the wind had dropped, and Wilfred was able to get back aboard the Princess May, where Paul had spent the night, and they continued their journey northward. When they had finally reached Hopedale, over 100 fishing schooners were at anchor, along with the Albert. Elliot Kerwin was already busy tending to the fishermen's medical needs, so Wilfred visited the Moravian missionaries and held services on shore. By now, Wilfred Grenfell, at age 28, was something of a legend along the Labrador coast. Everyone wanted to meet him and hear him preach. Wilfred found the biggest meeting room in Hopedale and announced a meeting that night. The room was so packed that Captain Terzies had to hold an overflow service in a nearby building. While Wilfred was in Hopedale, he heard news of a tragedy at sea. A schooner, the Rose, had headed out of St. John's, carrying far too many passengers and crew, 62 people in all. While sailing through dense fog, the vessel had hit an ice pan and crushed her bow. The Rose sank to the bottom 8 minutes later. Men, women, and children were forced overboard into the icy water. Thankfully, another schooner soon arrived on scene, and 50 people were rescued. But 8 men, 2 boys, and 2 girls perished in the icy water. Wilfred was furious when he heard of the tragedy, which was so avoidable. He had seen the Rose moored in St. John's. Not only was she an old, poorly maintained schooner, but also she was far too small to carry 62 people. Wilfred extended his notes to include ways the government can help reduce carnage at sea. He noted that the schooners should be forbidden to carry too many passengers, and that the proper lifeboats and emergency equipment should be required for all those on board. When it was time for Wilfred to leave Hopedale, one of the Moravian missionaries, a Danish man, asked if he could go along as a pilot. Wilfred readily agreed, and so the Moravian man, Paul Leggett, and Wilfred all set out northward. The waters they were headed into were totally uncharted, and so as a precaution, Wilfred borrowed a ladder at Hopedale that he lashed onto the mast so he could climb it for a better view of the treacherous reefs they would encounter. They made it 160 miles north, all the way to Okak, until reluctantly Wilfred turned the Princess May around. The water was beginning to look oily, a sure sign that it was reaching freezing point. By the time they reached Hopedale again, most of the schooners had already headed south, and the Albert was pulling up anchor. Wilfred followed the Albert's route, stopping in at the tiny settlements where the Liviers were preparing to winter. The Albert and the Princess May set up again at Battle Harbor. Wilfred was delighted to hear that the doctors and nurses at the hospital there had been kept busy all summer. Now it was time for them to close the hospital for winter and all head back to St. John's. Wilfred and Paul headed south in the Princess May, while the others traveled in the Albert. They had planned to rendezvous at St. Anthony Harbor, Newfoundland, before continuing to St. John's. However, they ran into foul weather, and the Princess May lost her mast, which was washed overboard along with the mission flag it was flying. When he finally reached St. Anthony Harbor, Wilfred waited for several days for the Albert to arrive. When she did not come, he steamed out of the harbor and headed for St. John's, all the while wondering what had happened to his co-workers. When he steamed into St. John's Harbor, Wilfred saw that the Albert was already anchored there. "They're alive! The doctor's alive!" The shouts went up from the pier as the Princess May drew closer to shore. Wilfred soon learned that the Princess May's mast and flag that had washed overboard had been found floating off the coast, and everyone assumed that the launch had been swamped in the storm and sunk. The Albert herself had been damaged in the storm, and Captain Trezise had made the decision to head straight for St. John's without nearing land again. To Wilfred's dismay, news of his death had already been published in the Times of London newspaper, and memorial services were being planned. A telegram announcing that Wilfred was alive was dispatched immediately, and Wilfred hoped that his mother was not too distraught at the erroneous story of his death. Wilfred and his friend Arthur were soon on the move again. They had decided to visit Canada to raise money for their work in Newfoundland and Labrador. It was already growing, and Wilfred knew that the national mission to deep-sea fishermen in England could not financially sustain it much longer. He hoped to interest the Canadian government in providing $5,000 to build a third hospital at the inner end of Belle Isle Strait, an area within Canada's border. After seeing Elliot Kerwin and the two nurses off to England aboard the Albert, Wilfred and Arthur boarded a passenger steamer for Halifax, Nova Scotia. When they arrived on December 3, 1893, they had little idea of how to proceed. They booked a room in a hotel and tried to decide what to do. Eventually, they settled on a simple plan. They would visit all the leading people in Halifax, government officials, the president of the Board of Trade, clergymen, and military officials, and ask for help. While Wilfred fretted that this approach was too direct, without contacts or introductions, it was the best they could think of to do. The visits were more successful than Wilfred had hoped. He and Arthur were well received everywhere they went, and their message was listened to with interest. By the end of the week, a public meeting had been set up with both the Anglican bishop and the Canadian Prime Minister agreeing to attend. The meeting went well, and a committee was formed to assist the work of Dr. Grenfell. Emboldened by the success of their time in Halifax, Wilfred and Arthur traveled on to Montreal, where they hoped to meet with Sir Donald Smith, the last resident governor of the Hudson Bay Company in Canada. As a young man, Sir Donald had been the company's manager at Hamilton Inlet, and Wilfred was sure that he was aware of the perils of living on the Labrador coast. Sir Donald had become an extremely wealthy man and was known to be interested in funding medical work. Once again, Wilfred met with success. Sir Donald agreed to meet with him and Arthur. The men talked together for several hours, swapping stories about people and places along the Labrador coast. Sir Donald introduced Wilfred and Arthur to other wealthy men, who promised to consider supporting the mission. In the meantime, Sir Donald gave Wilfred and Arthur 2 first-class tickets on the Canadian Pacific Railway so that they could continue their fundraising efforts all the way to Vancouver Island on Canada's west coast. Everywhere Wilfred and Arthur went, they were greeted by interested and enthusiastic people willing to band together to sponsor a hospital bed or a berth aboard one of the mission ships. When they got back to Montreal, good news awaited them. Sir Donald was ready to provide $1,800 to purchase another steamer for the mission, and another man was willing to pay for a smaller sailboat. Wilfred was glad to have this news to take home with him to England. By early March, Wilfred was back in Gorleston once again, overseeing the work of the mission in the North Sea. Many things had changed in the 9 months he had been away. For one thing, the coppers, the small boats that supply alcohol to the fishermen at sea, had been outlawed. In addition, more and more steam-powered trawlers were showing up on the North Sea. These new trawlers were no longer dependent on the wind to trawl, and so could fish almost continuously. As Wilfred prepared for another summer on the Labrador coast, he received some disappointing news. Arthur Bobart announced that he was joining the Navy as a surgeon, and Elliot Kerwin went off to be a missionary in Peking, China. Wilfred hated to lose these 2 doctors, who by now knew so well the needs and conditions in Labrador, but he was relieved when 2 new recruits stepped forward, Dr. Fred Wilway, who was on loan from the London Missionary Society, and Dr. John Bennett, who hoped to become a permanent member of the mission. Nurses Cecilia Williams and Ada Carwardine sailed for St. John's aboard the Albert. However, the mission committee had decided that the Albert would not be staying on the Labrador coast that summer, since she was needed back in the North Sea. Instead, 2 new boats would be brought into service alongside the Princess May. The first of these new vessels was named Sir Donald, after Sir Donald Smith, who had provided the money to buy her. She was a 75-foot-long, 14-foot-wide steamer, and it was hoped that she would be fitted out and ready for service when Wilfred arrived in St. John's. The Sir Donald was built for the rough conditions of the Labrador coast, and she was a great improvement over the Princess May. The Princess May had been built as a river steamer, and the conditions of Labrador had pushed her beyond her limits in the previous summer. By the time she had made it back to St. John's, her boiler pipes were leaking and the propeller shaft once again was bent. As a result, the Princess May was now in dry dock, undergoing a complete overhaul. The second boat was named the Aurelia Mackinnon. She was a 16-foot-long half-deck sailboat that one of Sir Donald's associates had donated the money to buy. She had been purchased in England and would be transported to St. John's by steamer. On June 12, 1894, Wilfred set sail for St. John's from Liverpool aboard the SS Monica. The Aurelia Mackinnon stowed safely in her hold. Traveling with him was Dr. Robert Wakefield, another of Wilfred's recruits for the summer. They arrived in St. John's 12 days later, where Wilfred was met with the now familiar rousing welcome. The Princess May was still in dry dock being overhauled, and Wilfred soon learned that the Sir Donald was not yet ready for duty. Wilfred was anxious to get on his way up the coast, but he was forced to exercise patience. It was not until August that the Sir Donald was finally ready to be put to sea. Eagerly, Wilfred got up got up steam in the vessel, and they headed north. Dr. Wakefield, who was mechanically minded, served as engineer, and John Harvey, a Newfoundland captain, would serve as pilot. Their initial destination was Battle Harbor. The Albert had deposited a doctor and nurse at the hospital there, and at the hospital at Indian Harbor. Wilfred was anxious to see how things were progressing at both hospitals. As they approached the Battle Harbor, Wilfred decided to make a grand entrance in the new boat. "Full speed ahead," he ordered, once he thought they were clear of the rocks and reefs. They were just about to round the headland into Battle Harbor, but the mission flags hoisted for the occasion They were just about to round the headland into Battle Harbor, the mission flags hoisted for the occasion flapping in the breeze, when a rumbling, grinding noise arose from the hull of the Sir Donald. The boat stopped abruptly and lurched to one side. It had run aground on a rock. The engine was put full astern, but the boat was stuck fast and began to be pounded by the sea. There was only one thing to do. A dinghy was lowered into the water, and Wilfred and Captain Harvey climbed aboard and rowed to shore. Once ashore, they had to climb up a rocky cliff to get to the community of Battle Harbor to seek help. Sheepishly, Wilfred told everyone what had happened. Benge, the merchant who had donated the building for the hospital at Battle Harbor, was visiting the community, and he raised steam in his launch and went out to pull the Sir Donald free of the rocks and into port. The Sir Donald had been badly damaged. Her stern post had been wrenched to one side, bashing in her rudder, and her propeller shaft had snapped, and the propellers lost at sea. Wilfred was guilt-ridden as he inspected the damage that his enthusiasm to make a grand entrance had caused. It was obvious that the Sir Donald would be out of commission for quite some time. Fortunately, the Albert was still at anchor in the harbor, awaiting Wilfred's arrival. It was past time for Captain Trezise to be heading back to England, but he agreed to tow the Sir Donald back to St. John's, where repairs could be made to her. With the Albert needed back in England, the Sir Donald damaged, and the Princess May still months away from being fully overhauled, Wilfred had only the sailing boat, the Euralia Mackinnon, to use. Disappointed as he was at what had happened, he decided to make the most of what he had. That summer, the Euralia Mackinnon plied the waters up and down the Labrador coast. Several liveyeres took turn completing the two-man crew, and Wilfred enjoyed wonderful sailing conditions. It reminded him of the times he and Algernon had gone out in the Reptile on the estuary of the River Dee. The fact that he could take few supplies with him on the Euralia Mackinnon allowed Wilfred to get closer to the coastal people. After he had tended to their medical needs and held a simple church service, the local people invited him back to their homes for a meal with a good night's rest. Wilfred visited both of the hospitals and was amazed at what the doctors and nurses had achieved. He was especially gratified to see the Indian Harbor Hospital up and running. Between them, the two hospitals had treated 1,306 patients that summer. As winter approached, Wilfred Way volunteered to stay on at Battle Harbor. He planned to take a dog team and a komatik, a sled, and visit homes along the coast when the sea froze over. As he had done the summer before, Wilfred made notes on the people and places he visited. One particular incident that haunted his thoughts occurred when he sailed into a lonely inlet. A single hut stood by the shore, and inside Wilfred found a woman and 2 teenage children. Outside were 3 freshly dug graves. It did not take Wilfred long to learn that the husband, who had not been able to catch many fish during the summer months, had sent his wife and 2 oldest children down to the creek to trap fish. While they were away, he had killed himself and the 2 youngest children. Wilfred gave what supplies he had to the grieving woman and her 2 surviving children, and promised to call on them in the spring to see if they wanted to remain at the inlet or relocate to St. John's. They had no one to help them, even if they went to St. John's, and the mother could not read or write. All Wilfred could do was gather the family together and pray that God would protect them until they met again. Oh wait, I skipped that. After he wanted to see if they want to relocate to St. John's. Either way, he knew their lives would be difficult, and then they had no one to help them. So next paragraph. Wilfred traveled down the Labrador coast barely ahead of the ice. As usual, he was the last boat headed south. He stopped at Square Island Harbor, where 12 families lived and where things were in a desperate state. The traders who normally stop in to exchange flour, butter, and molasses for salted fish and sealskins had all sailed right past the bay without stopping. With 8 long months of winter ahead, the families were already running out of supplies. On a previous visit to this community, Wilfred had met with a saintly old fisherman whom everyone called Uncle Jim. Now, as Uncle Jim described the situation to Wilfred, the 2 men knelt and prayed. Uncle Jim asked God to open the window of heaven and send them supplies. Wilfred agreed with a hearty amen, and the 2 of them waited to see what would happen next. Wilfred spent the night at Uncle Jim's cabin, and the following morning he looked out the window to see a trading schooner at anchor. It was one of the vessels that had passed by several days before. The captain of the vessel explained that they had gotten caught in a storm and had been driven back all the way to Square Island Harbor. And now that he was there, he was happy to exchange the settlement stockpile of dried fish and skins for flour, salt pork, and tea. Uncle Jim grinned as he knelt to thank God for saving them all from starvation. His simple faith brought tears to Wilfred's eyes. By October, Wilfred was back in St. John, where he learned some shocking news. The banks of Newfoundland had failed. No one could say exactly why it happened, but businesses were bankrupt. Government officials had all quit, and there were riots in the street. The governor had urgently sent a representative to London to plead for help for the colony. Wilfred hated to leave while everything was in such an upheaval, but he had promised to be back in England by Christmas. He could only pray that things would sort themselves out. In the meantime, there was little hope of getting any more financial aid from the government and the people in St. John's.